Hello, everybody. It is Sunday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, assistant sports editor for multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joined for our weekly Steelers mock draft tracker video by Brian Batko, our Steelers insider. We're going to be talking about the weekend mock draft picks for the Steelers from across the internet. It's a big week with the NFL Combine ongoing in Indianapolis. Brian, we saw some new names this week that we haven't seen through the process. I think Walter Nolen from Ole Miss was the big headline, a guy Ray Fittipaldi has been talking about a lot. Omarion Hampton, the UNC running back, has somewhat gotten lost in the shuffle with some of the other big names at that position, but we did see him in a mock draft earlier this week. So, lots of names to get into. Brian, I'm excited about it. How have you liked the Combine so far?
I'm wondering about the Combine. I tweeted this on Thursday. Seems like just more and more every year, fewer players are doing any of the things that made the Combine what it is and so marketable over the years. A lot of them are citing minor injuries, but even some of the guys we're going to talk about, like Walter Nolen from Ole Miss, the defensive tackle, is basically like, yeah, I want to clean up my technique, so I'm going to just do the drills at my pro day. And it's like, okay, I guess I can understand that, but part of the Combine is literally comparing yourself against the other people at your position. And that might be a signal that he's a clear-cut first rounder and doesn't really have much to prove or gain and could only hurt himself by doing it. But man, I do sort of wonder, how far away are we from basically every first round guy or even fringe first round guy saying, I don't really want to run a 40 in front of everybody here. I'll do it at my pro day where I'm comfortable, or I just won't do it at all. And I also won't do the drills, and I'll do that at my pro day with my college assistants and teammates. And that's the best thing for me. I don't necessarily question the long-term viability of the Combine, because I think there's always going to be value in literally combining every team and prospect in one place to get medicals and those face-to-face interviews. But it seems like we might be losing the plot a little bit with, I can't wait to watch this guy run the 40 or do the vertical or do the position drills, because the most relevant ones are seemingly bowing out more and more every year.
Well, I think it's partially an outgrowth, Brian, of the opting out of bowl games, opting out of, senior bowls, things like that. You've got this class of prospects who thinks that they can only lose, but I think there's precious few people that are really in that category. And I think you run the risk, if you don't, run some of these drills sometimes in front of scouts, that someone else is going to, and someone else is going to start flying up draft boards who maybe wasn't on the radar before. So you somewhat put yourself at risk of being compared to that person. So if you're a top 5 guy, if you're like Abdul Carter from Penn State, okay, maybe I can see it. If you get down to that 10, 20, 30 range, I don't really know what you're preserving, because usually those guys are in precarious enough spots anyway that they can fall, 10, 20 picks, and that can make a big difference on the rookie contract.
I think it trickles down. I think it trickles down, though, Adam, because if Abdul Carter says, well, I'm not going to do anything, the most and the dirty secret of all this, right, is you can put too much stock into the quote unquote underwear Olympics. I mean, it should be like the cherry on top of the scouting evaluation, or maybe a tiebreaker, because all these teams, they've watched the guys in person at their games throughout the season. They've combed through every possible cut up you could comb through, and ultimately that stuff is way more weighted than their 3-cone drill time. So you get an Abdul Carter say, I don't need to do that. Just watch what I did last season. I'm a freak. I'm a beast. I should be the number 1 pick. But then Mason Graham, the next, the top D lineman, says, I probably don't need to do that either. I also have that on tape. And then it trickles down to the next D lineman, and then the next D lineman, and the next D lineman says, well, no, I know I'm next, kind of in the pecking order. So yeah, eventually the buck will stop with a guy who's like, no, I'm here to compete and kick some butt and show people, what I'm made of. But I don't know. It's just now you're seeing fewer head coaches go to the Combine too. The Rams as an organization haven't attended since COVID, I think. So that's just one of the little things I've kind of noticed thus far. But obviously we'll keep covering it intently, and there's still going to be a ton of interest in it.
Yeah, there's still some storylines to talk about, so I'm excited to get into it with you, Brian. Before we do, just want to thank our sponsor for this episode of the podcast. Oh, no, go ahead, Brian.
Somebody was saying, if they can't televise Abdul Carter and Shadur Sanders and Cam Ward doing the drills with a 40, 5-10 years from now, are we going to see the NFL Network televising the Giants sit-down interview with Shadur Sanders, and that is going to be the combine coverage. My sister-in-law's boyfriend Jordan put that in my head. I'm like, you know what? We've got Hard Knocks, we've got everything else, so maybe it would be softball questions because you're not going to really dig into stuff if it's the televised portion of it, but just some food for thought.
Yeah, be interesting to see how that unfolds. I think there's always going to be, I don't care who the draft pick is or who the prospect is. There's some people that will watch every single one of them on the couch through the whole week, no matter what. So it will be interesting to see how that evolves. Like I mentioned, this show is sponsored by Mike's Beer Bar. Meet us at Mike's on the North Shore for the ultimate sports experience. With over 20 TVs, you won't miss any of the action. Pirates games, River Hound and Premier League matches, college and pro football, hockey, and every major sporting event. Plus, don't miss the Post-Gazette's NFL Draft live stream happening Thursday, April 24th and Friday, April 25th, live from Mike's Beer Bar. Enjoy 300 local beers, 80 local beers, and an incredible food lineup, including their famous Steak on the Stone. When you need your sports fix, and especially for the NFL Draft, tell your friends to meet us at Mike's. Excited for the live show coming back this year at Mike's Beer Bar. Brian, all right, let's dig into it with Walter Nolen. It's a name, like I mentioned at the top of the show, Ray Fittipaldo talks a lot about. I think a lot of people locally are looking at this defensive lineman, but this was the first mock, at least that I'd seen in mock draft season by the Sporting News, connecting Walter Nolen of Ole Miss to the Steelers in the first round. He checks a lot of boxes. He's big, but he's not a traditional nose tackle. Those are somewhat becoming extinct in the NFL. So tell me about Walter Nolen and why he might make sense for the Steelers at number 21.
Yeah, it is kind of funny. I mean, it's all relative. We say he's not one of the bigger tackles in this class, but he's still 6'3", 290. He's just he's more stout than a Derrick Harmon. He's more quick than just a humongous Kenneth Grant, who's so wide he can take up two linemen most of the time. But yeah, I mean, he's explosive. His get off is pretty special as far as the D lineman in this group. That's why he was the number one overall recruit a few years ago. And I mean, you have to really like when you dig into what he did last year at Ole Miss. He was one of the Senior Bowl standouts and said he was like the first guy this year that's like, wow, he's actually way better than everyone he would be competing with here. He's actually just going to shut it down a day or two in. He proved that he doesn't need to be here. Teams love him. So he's got all that going for him. I do sort of wonder a little bit with Nolen, and like, I'm not trying to, well, I guess I am trying to nitpick because we could sit here and talk about how great everybody is all the time. And we can talk about all the stats that are widely available and all of that. But I think scouts will sort of, when they first do that deeper dive and look into the background, which I think is always the preliminary evaluation process. I mean, Walter Nolen was at 4 different high schools. He transferred in college too, from Texas A&M to Ole Miss. I think he'll have teams in the interviews, whether it's in Indy or if they bring him in for 30 visits. I think he'll be a popular man for the on-site visits here, or when they go to his pro day, which is now even more of a part of the offseason calendar because he's not going to work out, do the on-field drills at the combine. So I think they'll dig into a little bit of that, and what kind of football character does he have? Why did he bounce around so much? Is that a concern at all? Or is he someone who plays hard and, that's just a circumstantial deal and you'd be happy to get someone with that level of talent on your defense no matter the scheme?
You and I were texting about this a little bit, setting up the show of Nolen, Kenneth Grant of Michigan, who you mentioned, Derrick Harmon of Oregon, kind of being maybe the holy trinity for the Steelers at that defensive tackle, defensive line position. Is that how you're looking at it, where the Steelers would probably be happy to get any one of those 3 if they're available at number 21? And if so, how would you maybe power rank them at this stage of the process? Obviously, things can change. We'll find out, possibly later on if the Steelers are more interested in one versus the other. But just knowing what we know now, how would you kind of rank those guys in terms of how they would fit in that Steelers defense?
Well, first of all, I think there's no guarantee they're going to take a D tackle in the first round. We've still got a lot of dominoes to fall that way, both the pre-draft process, but also what they do in free agency, where they spend their money, where they strengthen the depth chart, and where they'll still have some relative weaknesses. But yeah, for the sake of conversation, let's say they have made up their mind. Like, okay, we need to restock the pipeline on the D line. So we're not going best player available. We are drafting by position of need. We're taking someone there no matter what. I don't think all three guys would be gone by 21. Nolen seems the most likely to be gone, probably followed by Kenneth Grant and then Derrick Harmon. I'd probably rank them as Grant number one. I mean, it just seems like his motor is exceptional. And yeah, he's probably the best suited to be that true nose tackle when you want to get down and dirty in these January matchups with the Browns and the Ravens. And I'd probably go Nolen too, because I think he's just a better athlete and probably more of a game wrecker than Derrick Harmon. But Harmon he gets compared a lot to Cam Hayward, compares himself to Cam Hayward. I almost think he has more of a Stephon Tuitt build. I think he's a little bit leaner maybe in the lower half, but he transferred from Michigan State to Oregon and was a key cog for that Ducks defense last year. So that's probably how I'd stack them up right now. But in reality, there might even be tiers. It might be like, okay, if Kenneth Grant's there, we're not thinking about any other position. We're just running it up to the podium. If Nolen's there, well, maybe we have to compare that to the best wide receiver or the best DB on the board. And if it's Harmon, maybe that's okay. This is our backup plan because he's a good player and we do need to get younger and more physical on the D line. So it does seem like the brain trust of Steelers media, not just us at the PG, but other outlets too, are kind of lumping those three together because they're not as likely to be a Mason Graham top 5 or top 10 pick, but they all seem like surefire first rounders. I'll be curious as the mock draft machine churns from now until late April. Does anybody else start to gain first round steam, whether it's a Tyleik Williams, Ohio State's best defensive tackle, or somebody like Shemar Stewart from Texas A&M is another one we've discussed a lot. So stay tuned on all that. And, they're all kind of different shapes and sizes of players at a position of need.
Yeah, Deone Walker from Kentucky is another name that we know Mike Tomlin was paying attention to on the All-Star.
Seems like he's kind of slipped to the backup plan, area of things. But yeah, you never know. He's massive. He's bigger than all three of those guys we just talked about.
Yeah, and I think that's a relevant way to answer the question. When I was asking, I think it was more in terms of like, do they view those three separate from any other defensive line prospects if they're going to go in that direction, or should they, or should we be looking at them as kind of the pole position type of guys, where if they're there's no real reason to talk about some of these other guys, and that could still change. But for now, that seems to be the vibe a lot of us are getting.
And I do think since Omar Khan and Andy Weidel have taken over, they've maybe mirrored traditional draft analyst boards more than they had in the Kevin Colbert years. So that's something else to consider, that, if you're seeing on most places, it's kind of Grant, Nolen, Harmon right in a row as mid to late first round picks. Maybe it's a little less likely that a Terrell Edmonds type sneaks in there the way he has in years past for the Steelers under a different regime.
Brian, I also wanted to talk running backs. I saw Omarion Hampton mocked to the Steelers in the first round for the first time this week by Bucky Brooks of NFL.com. We got a lot into last week talking about running backs and when's too early, when's the appropriate time. So I leave that. If you want to view that conversation, look at last week's video on the channel. I just wanted to ask specifically about Hampton and how he's, I think in some ways, kind of gotten lost in the running back radar conversation for the Steelers behind Ashton, Jeanty, behind Quinshon, Judkins, maybe TreVeyon Henderson, both of Ohio State. How do you view Hampton within that group? And is he someone we should be talking more about? Maybe not necessarily for the first round, but just as a running back that the Steelers might be interested in at any point if he's available.
Yeah, definitely. I think he's probably the second best back in this class. I mean, Ashton Jeanty, I hate to use the cliche generational. I'll just say he had generational production at Boise State. And I think that puts him in a certain class of his own for running backs. His explosiveness is just far and away puts him in a different category. And that's why he was a close runner-up for the Heisman Trophy. But I would have Hampton number 2 because he's bigger than Jeanty. Like I said, not quite that level of just ridiculous burst, but He doesn't usually get brought down by one guy either, and he was really consistently productive last year and this past season at UNC. So I could see him sneaking into the first round. Again, I don't think the Steelers should go down that avenue like they did a few years ago with Najee Harris if Jeanty is off the board. But if Hampton is a guy who the rest of the league kind of decides also collectively, yeah, first round is not the right place to get new running backs, then if he's there in the second when they're picking, I think you absolutely have to consider it. I think he could be a surefire featured back in the NFL, much like Najee Harris was, and maybe with some more juice too than he had. So yeah, I really like Omarion Hampton. I think round one is too rich for my blood, at least for the Steelers and some of their scar tissue drafting running backs that high. But he is really good, really fun player to watch if you feel like clicking on some highlights.
Well, I did want to ask you about his style because he's known as more of a physical punisher type of guy. Is that what the Steelers want at this stage, or do you look at Najee Harris's tenure and sometimes I think that the athleticism and the quickness and that kind of stuff has left some fans wanting? Is that what the Steelers are looking for? Are they looking for a guy who's maybe a little bit more balanced, has a little more home run potential at that position to balance, how things didn't exactly work the way people hoped with Najee Harris?
Well, I think if you can get both in the same guy, that's ideal, right? But that's also why those players might be late first rounders or early second round picks at running back. I mean, I think Hampton is probably the best blend of that, maybe even more than Jeanty in a way. I think Jeanty is someone who can elevate an offense better than any other running back in this class. But yeah, Hampton is someone who, can run tough between the tackles. I think he's got some juice too, more so than probably the other like quote unquote bigger backs in this class, whether it's Kaleb Johnson from Iowa or Cam Scattaboo from Arizona State, who I think we all watched him in that afternoon college football playoff game, just looking like he was wrecking Whippeal defenses against Texas. So I think Hampton probably has a little bit more giddy up to him. Maybe not as much as TreVeyon Henderson from Ohio State, but he's bigger. Quinshon Judkins is interesting too, but I think I like Hampton more. So he's the type of guy who, I think if he were to land in Pittsburgh somehow, he's your clear-cut number one. Jaylen Warren is spelling him. And if you wait till the third or fourth round to get a running back, then I think you're bringing in somebody who's going to be more of a committee 50-50 type of split with Jaylen Warren.
Brian, another running back who came up this week in that same Sporting News mock that I referenced that had the Steelers taking Walter Nolen was Kaleb Johnson of Iowa. He was awesome this past season for the Hawkeyes, averaged 6.4 yards per carry. The thing that stood out to me was 21 touchdowns, had a nose for the end zone and those short yardage situations. Already looks like a Steeler with those Hawkeye uniforms.
Yeah.
Is he in this conversation for you at all? Or where does he fall in that continuum that you just gave me of the clear number one versus a committee situation with Jaylen Warren if the Steelers decided to go that direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's in that next group of guys behind Hampton with the Ohio State running backs. Probably some people who are slipping my mind at the moment. But yeah, Johnson too, you have to like his frame and his build. I mean, it seems like he's probably built for those playoff matchups in bad weather. And we know the Steelers love their Big Ten guys. So he was a breakout player in 2024. So while he might be new to a lot of like the draft nicks out there, I don't think he'll be new to the Steelers. They've been hot on the trail at Iowa the past couple off seasons, looking at players like Jack Campbell, Lucas Van Ness, Cooper DeJean, Logan Lee, whom they actually drafted last year on the D-line. So they've been hitting those pro days with the Hawkeyes, I would assume, in addition to doing their due diligence on that year's draft eligible prospects. They're probably also asking around about, okay, who are the next ones coming up? Maybe Kaleb Johnson caught their ear at times, and maybe they'll really take a liking to him staying in the black and, I'll say, gold next season.
Brian, a name I wanted to ask you about. I've seen him loosely connected to the Steelers a couple of times, kind of on the fringe of the conversation because a lot of people expect him to go earlier. But Will Johnson, the cornerback from Michigan, has some questions about his athleticism to answer this week in Indianapolis. His stock seems to have slipped from like a top 5 guy to maybe in that 5 to 10. I've seen him go as far down as 15 range. So it seems like he's slipped a little bit in terms of stock in these mock drafts. If he doesn't have a standout athletic performance at the combine and
He
drops,
said Thursday he's not going to work out at the combine.
oh,
So
he did say, okay, I didn't
yeah,
see that.
he's citing, I guess, like the toe injury. It's another one of these, like we talked about at the top, fully healed, but not going to test it out just yet in Indy. So, I mean, they're the best prospects in the draft are always trying to play both sides of the street on that.
Well, let me frame the question this way then, Brian. Is he a guy that's on your radar if he is available, if he's still on the board at 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, is he still the guy you're watching closely and considering, especially if we get into that best player available versus need situation, because a lot of people have had him so high in the process, because he's a playmaker, had a bunch of interceptions at Michigan, scored a lot of touchdowns at Michigan, did the things that the Steelers have been lacking, from Minkah Fitzpatrick, from Joey Porter Jr. in this defense the last handful of years. Is he still someone that you're watching, or is it more on the periphery of the conversation for you?
I think it's on the periphery because I was honestly pretty surprised to even see that someone out there had him falling all the way to the Steelers. I mean, hey, I guess it's possible if there are concerns about, not just the injury, but also, his overall speed. And now he's kind of ducking that opportunity in Indy on the same track as a bunch of other guys at his position. But I think if his stock falls, Adam, it's more of like falling from a top 5 pick to a top 15 pick. Like I never thought he'd be in the same stratosphere because he's just been so good to this point in college. Now, granted, a lot of his bona fides were built up 2 years ago with his 2023 performance. And I think he only played 4 or 5 games this past season before shutting it down and not being cleared to return from that turf toe injury. So I still think he's just somebody with the measurables and, the kind of technician that he is. And he has just proven it time and time again so much at that level in the Big Ten for the national champs a couple years ago that a team's not going to let him slip down that far. If he did, hey, it'd be an interesting conversation for the Steelers to have. I imagine they'd be, a lot of people at home would be saying, yes, you don't even think for a second about that. You go draft them. Well, I would just say, then why did the 15 to 16 teams before the Steelers not do the same thing? So I'm not in the camp of going defensive back high again this year. But if that's the circumstance, you certainly have to take a look at it.
Yeah, I'm in that category too of like he's not the type of guy, and I think I'm generally entering this draft with the idea of you're going to be able to draft someone you need at number 21. In years past, I would say, okay, maybe trade up for someone you want, but there's so many places of need for this team right now. He doesn't rise to the level of a guy that I would trade up to get and say, he's still on the board. But if he is there at 21, then yes, I think it becomes an interesting conversation.
You always want good young corners in your building, but I mean, the Steelers have Joey Porter Jr. and then to a lesser extent, Corey Trice. I think they're going to hit the free agent market at that position this year, particularly. And I think it makes sense because what kind of player do you want to infuse to those two guys? I would say more than another young player who's figuring it out on the fly. You want a vet who's been there, done that, like they've had with Dante Jackson, Patrick Peterson, Levi Wallace. Your mileage may vary on the way those guys played once they got here. So ideally, you're going to sign someone who is a little bit better, physically in between the lines, but same kind of mindset. I think of it would be good to have some experience at that number 2 corner spot.
I agree, Brian. A name we've talked about a lot that we don't talk about a lot in these videos to the extent we can because he's in so many mock drafts is Emeka Egbuka of Ohio State. I think the biggest headline in the mock draft world of the week was Mel Kiper Jr. for the first time had the Steelers taking Egbuka. Is he the pole position guy for you right now, Brian, just given that there's so much buzz about the Steelers, liking him to some extent, the need being there, his professionalism being a kind of change of pace from what we've seen from the Steelers at that position. Obviously, a lot can change. The combine changes things, pro day changes things, but at least to this point, it does feel like Egbuka is kind of the front runner here to the extent that that's a thing that exists.
I think so. And I mean, maybe he doesn't have the ceiling of some of the other players in this class, maybe in some of the other guys at his position, like a Luther Burden, Matthew Golden from Texas. But I just think it does make sense when you bring up the wide receiver issue and all the issues the Steelers have had at that position. I think everybody in the organization would love a nice deep breath and sigh of relief that, okay, we're getting one who's pretty good, first round caliber talent wise, but also first round kind of character when we've been playing whack-a-mole a lot at that position. I also just think in general, Steelers in their first round picks, I mean, raise the floor, shoot a little bit more for the high floor than the high ceiling one of these years, because I mean, we've seen Kenny Pickett flame out. We saw, jury's still way out on Broderick Jones. Troy Fautanu, I don't really want to ding him because the injury was kind of a freak thing, according to Troy. But, again, that was a first-round pick that you just got nothing from year one. Egbuka seems like a guy who you're going to get something from year one. And obviously the plan would be for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years after that too.
Yeah, a long-term piece, and kind of I don't think he might end up, I think maybe the best case scenario for him is a Hines Ward situation where, he doesn't have that career that's like standout Hall of Fame, obvious, first ballot type of guy, but he's right in that conversation, and it's just a productive guy who does, to me, the thing I like about him most is his willingness to go maybe to some of those grittier areas than the current Steelers receiver group does. So I think he's kind of won this first portion, because I look at it, Brian, as there's the whole kind of all-star and then pre-combine where we're just kind of getting to know these guys. Then you're now into the combine and pro day portion where you get a few more data points in front of you, and things start to shift up a little bit. You have free agency, which throws a wrench in things, and then you have that last month, that last sprint or so to the draft. I think Egbuka's won this first phase.
I should look this up and do a story on this, but I'm going to right now just try to think of it off the top of my head. Like, who was the quote unquote leader in the clubhouse this time a year ago? I'm not sure. It was definitely an O lineman. I know that much. Probably Amarius Mims, if I just think off the top of my head.
There were a lot of Mims drafts, yeah.
And you would be good at this too, because we've been doing these videos for a couple years now. 2 years ago, Broderick Jones was certainly in there, but so was Peter Skoronski, I think, and maybe a couple of the other linemen. But definitely Najee Harris, I remember, was like the first name that was on the top of everybody's list going back to 2021. 2022, we were all quarterback crazed. So I think it was Kenny Pickett, Malik Willis, Jordan Davis was in there too at the time. So Egbuka, like, I'll just boil it down like this. He has a lot of the Steelers' usual draft tropes on his side, with winning program, Ohio State, Big Ten, Ohio State, wide receiver. We know they like taking them, not always in the first round lately, but first couple rounds. And then he also has things that the Steelers don't have currently on their roster. When we talk about a bigger bodied, physical guy like that at wideout, to say nothing of maybe the leadership and intangibles that come with him too. So I think that's a pretty good marriage of two of the components we often discuss in these mock drafts.
Yeah, and I don't know that we super have talked about the character situation, but I think that Ben Roethlisberger raised the question: has the Steelers' way been lost? Are there no, once Cam Hayward, TJ Watt, if they're moving on in the next handful of years, who's going to be the keeper of that flame? I think Egbuka is a guy you can look at and say maybe that's the guy on offense that can take that torch and can understand and get it and be, provide leadership that goes beyond just what his production on the field, might say. Brian, the stretch of the week, I think, was the Draft Network mocked Will Howard to the Steelers in round 1. I've certainly seen some picks for him later in the draft. I think you and I have talked about him a couple of times on the show. I did not realize, because the comp was made to Ben Roethlisberger himself, I said there's no way Will Howard is anywhere close to as big as Ben Roethlisberger. And listen, Ben fluctuated in size in terms of the weight, I think, over the course of his career. So I guess The question is, what stage of Ben Roethlisberger are we talking about? But the last measurement I saw for Ben was 241 at 6'5".
Yeah.
Will Howard's 6'4", 235. Again, the first round's way too early for me. But do you look at that prototype at all and say, maybe I got to give him a second look if there's people out there comparing him to Big Ben?
It's funny you bring that up because for whatever reason, it's like some Mandela effect with Will Howard. But I too, like when I would watch him at Ohio State and, vaguely be familiar with him at Kansas State before that, I probably would have guessed he was like 6'1", 6'2". And I think maybe some of the psychology of that is like he was not a big recruit coming out of Downingtown, West or East, one of the Downingtowns. If we have any Eastern PA Steelers fans, they'll probably know and say, how could you get those two mistaken? But he's from Eastern PA. If you're a big-time quarterback in Eastern PA, you don't go to Manhattan, Kansas to play your college football. So Will Howard was kind of overlooked. And I think people tend to link that with, yes, questions about the, physical ability. But I did a deep dive on Howard for our quarterbacks on the big board, which is up now on the Post-Gazette website. Not only did, we all watched him at Ohio State, but I went back and looked at some of his high school basketball highlights at him. And he's like jumping off of 1 foot and dunking on people. So he's not an unathletic 6'4". He's not Cooper DeJean or Mac McClung out here, but he's got a little bit more to him that way than I think a lot of people do give him credit for. I think he's viewed so much as like he was a game manager for Ohio State. He was hitting wide open guys. He was taking chunks on the ground when they were there. So he's not going to blow you away with any of the, God-given stuff. But yeah, he does have good size. I compared him to Josh McCown in my big board write-up of him because, I don't think he's Ben. I don't see him shaking dudes out. He didn't transition from wide receiver to quarterback in high school, to my knowledge. And actually, despite that size, some of the more frequent knocks on him from the analysts are just like the arm talent, the arm strength that Ben had in spades. And, again, that's another reason why that comparison sort of quickly falls apart for me. But I do like Will Howard. I like all that about Will Howard. And another thing that I kind of tend to do when I just want to do my own research on some of these players is watch their interviews and sometimes the post games. I watched Will Howard's post game after that loss to Michigan. That guy, there's being a competitor and then there's being barely even able to ask a question because you're so distraught and PO'd about losing that game. Now, that's the nature of the Michigan-Ohio State rivalry, but I give him credit for even going up there to answer for it. I think that's a kind of baseline leadership quality. And the fire that I heard in the guy's voice and saw on his face, well, we all saw, the whole world saw what it led to. They won the national championship by running the table. So there's a lot to like about Will Howard that you have to reconcile with some of the, why did he airmail that throw? And can he fit balls into tight windows and, spray across the whole field in the NFL?
Yeah, and is he going to look as good when he doesn't have the best receiver in college football in Jeremiah Smith, and then your number 2 is Emeka Egbuka, who's probably going to be a first-round pick for somebody.
It's a little Kenny Pickett-ish. It's a little Kenny Pickett-ish to me. Like, a fifth-year guy who you always have like all right, you're playing against 18 and 19-year-olds now while you're 22 or 23. I think that's always an aspect of it, but really successful in his final year, basically a one-year wonder. He was productive at Kansas State, but it was Kansas State. He wasn't playing for the Buckeyes, and he's going to get a lot of high marks for the kind of gritty gym rat type stuff that Kenny did. So I'll be curious to see where the scouts kind of crystallize on Will Howard.
Well, we never saw that emotional gear from Kenny Pickett, and I think that was part of why he remained so unpopular with a lot of Steelers only fans. I think I probably shouldn't have said that way, but
new sponsor for the show.
Yeah, right, exactly. No, but Pitt at Pitt, you had, he's got his fan base of people who watched him at Pitt who maybe understand Kenny Pickett, but there's a reason why I think Kenny Pickett's been unpopular with Steelers fans. You never saw that kind of fire with him, and that kind of chip on his shoulder that we did see with even Will Howard earlier in the season. I remember pretty famously he was going into Penn State, and he was not recruited by Penn State despite being, like you said, an Eastern PA guy. He grew up a Penn State fan, went to a ton of games. His first game on the Beaver Stadium turf was as an Ohio State Buckeye, and he was fired up for it. He said, I can't wait. I wanted to go there my whole life. We'll see if I was good enough. He's the quarterback of the Ohio State Buckeyes, a guy who has, the world at his feet, goes on to win the national championship, but he still went into that game with that chip on his shoulder. And so, yeah, I see that gear with him. And I had the same thought too, Brian. You were saying you didn't know the size. I remember thinking the comp I kept making was to Penn State's Sean Clifford, who was kind of that game manager, lacked some of those physical tools. Right. But I interviewed Sean Clifford at Penn State Media Day not too long ago, and I kind of towered over him. I'm 6'2", and Will Howard's bigger than me. So clearly sometimes it just doesn't translate on TV. Anyway, that's enough Will Howard conversation for this week, I think. Brian, anything else standing out to you at the Combine? Any names that are maybe on your radar now that weren't, earlier in the week?
No, not really. The quarterbacks are, they're always going to be interesting, and we'll see how the wide receiver class shakes out. If there's only 3 or 4 first round caliber guys, that one that maybe we'll be talking about him on a future mock draft video, but it seems like Tet McMillan from Arizona's stock is dipping a little bit for some reason. The more that the draft Illuminati talk to, I guess, their people in the NFL communities, I still can't imagine a world where he's slipping to 21, but I believe in that Mel Kiper mock, he went 22 to the Chargers. So he actually had the Steelers taking Igbuka over 6'5" Arizona wide receiver Teteroa McMillan, who I think is, pretty clearly the best wide receiver only prospect in this draft. I don't know. It's tough to compare him to Travis Hunter. But yeah, I don't know what's behind that. Maybe just something to keep an eye on here in the coming days, weeks, and months with him.
Yeah, he was awesome. I remember early in the season at Arizona, he'd be possibly a cool pickup for the Steelers. But yeah, it's my radar went up too, because in the Igbuka pick, he says, I still have McMillan as number 1. I was like, wait, where is he then? And I looked further, and there was McMillan. So it'll be interesting to see how that whole situation plays out. Brian, thanks for joining me this week. We will be back next Sunday recapping the post-combine mocks that start to come out. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Got a lot more coming this week. The North Shore Drive with Christopher Carter will be back Monday. I'll be back Thursday with Jason Mackey. And in between, Brian, you have Chip Tammon football. Anything you have yet to tease on that?
We'll see. Probably something with fallout from the combine, whether it's the actual draft prospects themselves or maybe the quarterback carousel, get somebody on to chop that up, or maybe some of the rules changes type stuff that we're seeing bandied about now that all the NFL heavy hitters are in one place.
Yeah, so make sure you're subscribed. If you enjoyed this video, smash that like button, help us out in the YouTube algorithm. We always appreciate that, and we will talk to you again next week.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.